What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the GLE podcast. Phil here, and I'm excited today to share an awesome guest with you. But first, if you haven't yet, go check out goleadeverything.com/gear. We got some new gear. Some of y'all were bugging me for some GLE gear. You can see I'm wearing some today, but got some gear up at the gear store. So check out goleadeverything.com/gear. If you haven't yet, go subscribe, rate, leave a review at all the podcast platforms. We're on YouTube at the Phil Swanson channel on YouTube, or you can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Radio Public, Pocket Cast, all the platforms. You know them. Go give us a little subscribe, rate, review. You know the drill. On today's show, I am pleased to have an individual that has a tremendous career in a topic that y'all may not be familiar with. I know I wasn't until I've been chatting with him recently. A topic called franchising. And, you pass them every day, and you'd be surprised that I've learned more and more. You probably encounter more franchise businesses than you think on a day-to-day basis. So I'm really excited to introduce my guest today and pick his brain and have him share his story and wisdom with you on franchising. Bob Bernotas, welcome to
Phil.
GLE.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I love watching your introduction and you coming through with all the different faces, some bearded, some not so much, but see your growth pattern there, buddy.
There you go, man. There you go. So, Bob, why don't we start out with your story and just tell us a little bit about how you got into franchising. What brought you to the point where you're at today?
Failing at everything else I've done, maybe. Corporate America, I lasted, I think, all of 4 years in corporate America, hated every second of it. So I started a small computer business, knew nothing about it, but that was my first taste of being on my own. And but then I begged, borrow, and stole to get my first franchise open, which was a West Coast video franchise. Most of your listeners probably have no idea what that is, if they recognize the video industry at all.
Right.
But we used to rent VHS cassettes, stick them in a machine, and it would play movies for you. Things have changed. Excuse me. So you know where that industry is now, but that was my first foray into franchising. Opened one. It fortunately for me, it became the top unit in the chain pretty quickly and allowed me to move on to 2, 3, 4, and 5. But anyway, I've owned multiple franchise concepts over the course of my career that I've built and sold. I've been consulting for a couple of decades, mainly. I mean, I used to consult on the side of franchise companies, helping them position for growth. Over the last 10, 12 years, I morphed completely on the side of prospective franchisees, helping them find the right franchise concept. I was CEO of a national chain, and I am still a franchise investor. I just bought another one about 2.5 weeks ago, so I still get high on my own supply, so to speak.
Awesome. Very cool. So what interests you so much about franchising versus like traditional business ownership?
The success rate of franchises. I mean, you're buying into an existing model, a proven model with most franchise concepts. Now, look, there's over 4,000 franchise concepts out there. I will tell you that probably close to 2/3 of them, I won't go anywhere near. But then again, there's some really good franchise concepts out there, and they have done all the trial and error. They have proven the model. They have basically shortened the learning curve for the prospective franchisee. So when you get into one of these franchises, the right one, that is, your learning curve is going to be much, much shorter. And you are going to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that otherwise you may have experienced that in most cases would have put you out of business. I mean, the success rate for franchises is infinitely greater than the success rate for independent mom and pop operations.
Interesting. Do you know, like, order of magnitude, how much that probability increases?
Yeah, well, I mean, and there's a lot of debate about this, but I like to point to a Chamber of Commerce study that was done. It was good 20 years ago at this point, but they tracked a whole bunch of independent businesses that all opened around in the same year, and they tracked them over a 5-year period of time. They also tracked a whole bunch of franchises, again, that opened within the same year, and they tracked them concurrently over that same 5-year period of time. at the end of 5 years, 48% of the independent businesses were still up and operating, which actually surprised me. I did not
Yeah,
think
that's
it would
high.
be that high.
Yeah.
But the franchises, 97% were still operating. Now,
Wow.
some of them had turned over. 89% were still under the same ownership. Some were purchased by someone else for whatever reason. Maybe because they weren't doing that well. Maybe because it was just time for them to exit and sell their business.
Right. So that's an interesting thing. Maybe we can talk about that as we're beginning with the end in mind. You said the word exit, and I know many folks, at least the traditional folks, have the 401k, traditional investments. They're not necessarily thinking about an exit. They're thinking about retirement or something, whatever that looks like for them down the road. But in business, obviously, knowing what you're getting into and how you're potentially going to be able to get out of it at some point is important to know. So what exactly is an exit type of mindset as you're thinking about getting into business, and what exactly does that look like in franchising?
Yeah, that's a great question, because most people, when they're getting into franchising, if they're a franchise novice, they don't own other franchise entities. That's something they never think about, or rarely do they think about. So when I go into something, I'm always looking at it as potentially a 3 to 5 year exit. Now that I'm getting older, maybe a 2-3 year exit. But there's ways to position yourself to exit in a better situation. Uh, and really, there's multiple buckets of franchising. Uh, and I will tell you, first of all, as a general rule of thumb, in most cases, if you decide you build a franchise, you own it for a few years, 5 years, whatever period of time it tends to be, and then you decide you want to sell it. Often with franchises, you're going to fall in a 3 to 5 multiple of EBITDA. Excuse me. If you take the same business, doing the same amount of volume, dropping the same amount to the bottom line, that's non-franchised, typically you're not going to see a multiple that strong. And the reason being is the franchise company has infrastructure behind it. You have training, you have support. If you're buying a business that is non-franchised, what you typically will find is you have to depend on the owner. And is the owner going to train you? What happens if the owner gets hit by a truck? What happens if they get sick? What happens if they just don't do what they say they're going to do? And how much infrastructure do they really have in place to support you? So you have to depend upon that. And then additionally, you can't trust the numbers necessarily with an independent business versus a franchise. So if you're buying an existing franchise, or more importantly, selling an existing franchise, and this is why you'll get a higher multiple, typically what you will find is that buyers will be a lot more comfortable because the franchisor is going to support them. They're going to train them, and you can rely on the numbers, because whatever is being disclosed to you by that franchisee trying to sell you their business, you can go to the corporate office and simply ask them, hey, can you verify these numbers for me? And often the franchisor is getting involved in the sale of helping the franchisee sell it anyway. So you can trust the numbers. I'll give you one quick anecdotal story. Back when first franchise I got into, West Coast Video, I had 5 in the Philadelphia area. Lost my mind and went up to New York with them as well. But 2 of them were very, very close together. The first one I ever opened was on Wayne and Shelton Avenues in the Philadelphia area, and one was not far from there. I had a competitor he had one of his units. He owned 3 video stores. One of them was right between my 2 units, and my 2 units were pretty close together. So I decided I want to approach him to buy his unit. Now, my interest in it was simply to close it down, absorb his inventory and any other assets he had, and just absorb it and have my numbers go up. I went into it eyes wide open, or pretty educated. I made him an offer. He said, let me get back to you. He got back to me about a week later, and he came at me with a number that I thought was ridiculous. And I said, how are you justifying that? Well, here's my sales. Here's my profit margin. Then I already knew what he was doing. And the reason I knew it is because I had a couple of employees taking shifts, standing outside of his location with a clicker. Back then, didn't have iPhones, and just clicking every person that came in and making an observation. Typically, how many movies do they have?
Right.
So I knew the vol, and I knew his price, what he was renting for. So I knew the volume he was doing already. Well, he showed me numbers that suggested he was doing like twice that volume.
Hmm.
I got my accountant involved and did some forensics and came back to him and showed him, here's what you're doing. You are taking revenue from your other two locations and putting it into this location. You are taking expenses from this location and putting it into your other two locations. So he was cheap.
Mm.
Long story
Right.
short, he accepted my price because he was going to go out of business anyway, and I absorbed his inventory. There was some reason
Interesting.
for telling you that story, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's really interesting to hear, Bob, just kind of like, because I've heard even like if you are a traditional business owner and like you were saying, the business relies on you heavily, you don't have those processes and systems in place, it's even harder to effectuate a sale because then, they really can't buy it without you. And so you're kind of stuck having to still work in your business even after you sell it for some period of time.
usually
Um,
the case, yeah,
yeah,
you're right. Yeah.
which obviously, part of the point of the exit is you get to do that and you don't continue to work in it. But some people like that, I suppose.
I mean, some of the real benefits when it comes to an exit. I mean, like I bought a franchise 5 months ago, and it's brick and mortar, but it goes into office space, not retail. Without getting into the details, what it does, other than it's a men's health concept. The item 19 in their franchise disclosure document indicates the average unit. It was doing 1.8 million top line,
hmm
but over 500,000 bottom line. Okay, there's a reason why I bought that concept, and the startup cost they'll show in their item 7 of their franchise disclosure document between, I think it's 214 to 389. Okay, so call it maybe low 300s to open a unit, but if you could open something at that price and you can see that type of return, maybe by third year, if 500K is dropping to the bottom line, what's your business worth? It would
hmm
suggest on a 3 to 5 multiple, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 on something that I bought for 300, 325.
hmm
Consider that a pretty good investment. And those are the things that, look, I have lots of clients who are into real estate investment and do
hmm
phenomenally well with that. But when they see numbers like that and the equity that you can build and the cash flow that you can derive in the meantime,
hmm
it's pretty exciting. So many of my clients also own real estate, have real estate investments.
That's a really exciting thing for people to hear, Bob. And I know if they're like me, they're thinking, okay, he just threw out some big numbers. My blood starts pumping, my heart starts beating. Like I like the sound of that. But I'm always thinking to myself, okay, what exactly is the work required, time investment behind some of those numbers versus like, I don't know, the big hot thing today is like what, crypto or Bitcoin, or, I've got friends that are just, I bought Bitcoin, I'm holding it forever. I don't have to think about it. I know it's going to go up. They think that's their way, right? And
Right.
maybe it is, maybe it's not. But, what kind of time investment are we talking with franchises?
I
Probably
mean,
varies, yeah.
yeah, it's all over the map, and it really depends upon the model that you step into. I mean, you jump into virtually any franchise and do it on a full-time basis. Okay, franchising, in my opinion, is not about linear income where you're doing it and you never can escape it. So if you got into something consulting related, a consulting type franchise where you are the product, you're never escaping that. To me, that's not a sound investment. But most franchises, the vast majority, if you get into it full time, eventually it's going to become part time, and then less and less of your time invested once you have the right people in place and you have the right systems in place. But then there's also some concepts that are more passive concepts, your car washes, your salon suite concepts, maybe automated laundromats, things of that nature. Uh, Most of the brands that I tend to deal with and I love to put in front of my clients are ones that fall in a semi-passive category because those are still reasonably priced. You can scale reasonably, but more and more franchise companies are developing a platform to support franchisees at a higher level. Okay. And why are they doing this? They simply want to cast a wider net. So if you're a franchise company and the only people that you can lure into your system or get to buy your franchises are people that are going to jump into it full time, so somebody that's already retired, or they're willing to walk away from their job and jump into it, and there's a lot of perceived risk in that.
Mhm.
But more and more companies decided we're gonna build a robust platform that will support franchisees at a higher level. Things like national call center, things like in some cases we'll do your bookkeeping for you, but
Mhm.
lots of different help you with all the hiring. Uh, Allowing people to get into these semi-passive concepts and maybe spend in the early stages 10, 15, 20 hours a week squeezing it out. Might be tough in the early stages, but 6 months into it, a year into it, they're spending a lot less time. Again, when their systems are running smoothly and they have the right people in place. So
Mhm.
that's the category that I mainly play in, simply because I feel you can find more concepts that fit into that bucket. And usually they're very scalable. You don't have to spend a ton. You're not going to have to spend millions. So if you got into something like car washes, typically you're going to be somewhere between 2 million to maybe 7 million, and
Mhm.
a long, drawn out process to get the land, to get the zoning done, to build a building. It's a long process. But with these
Mhm.
semi-passive franchises, things that might start in $100,000 range go up to whatever you want to spend, but many are going to fall like in the 200 range to 400 range and still have pretty darn big upsides to them.
Yeah. You said on the front end, Bob, that there's probably 2/3 of franchises that you wouldn't even touch. Why is that? Is there, there's bad franchises out there?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
I say that about the industry that I play in, but there are plenty of bad franchises out there. But there's a lot of franchises. They're okay, but often you're buying yourself a job. They don't have semi-passive models,
Mhm.
and you're tethered to that franchise long term. And often it just doesn't have the earning capacity that I know that I want to see for my clients.
Mhm.
Uh, so if it's and not to disparage any one concept, but let's just say there is a food concept out there. It starts with sub and there's a Y on the end, and that concept. I mean, I wouldn't put anybody into it. I mean, because to earn any kind of decent money, you need to own a bunch of them. I have a client that I worked with, a woman who I think was in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and she had four of them, and she had just gotten to the point where maybe she can pull out $80,000 to $90,000 a year out of it, and she never got away from it. She was working more than full time in that concept. So
Jeez.
there's those to me don't make a lot of sense. And
Mhm.
franchising, in my opinion, is about leveraging other people, but it's the
Mhm.
simplicity of the model and which companies have the best support structure to help you do it with as and help you escape it at some point, if that makes sense.
Mhm. You also mentioned, Bob, that a lot of your real estate clients that like real estate also like franchises, or, potentially kind of go vertical somehow with that. What are your real estate clients doing with
Yeah,
franchising?
yeah. So,
Just kind of conceptually.
just to give you an idea of the type of real estate clients, I mean, some are into syndication, some are into multifamily buildings and so forth. Most are into maybe duplexes, single family homes, where they have a handful of them, and they maybe do a little rehab, they rent and so forth. Some are into flips, but most are holding the property. What I've discovered is that most of them aren't making any money. There's no cash flow. There's no positive cash flow, especially if they have a management company running it for them. They're usually
Right.
a little bit. Yeah, depending upon obviously how much you put down. You buy cash, obviously a different situation, but then you're tying up tons of capital. So in those situations, to me, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense unless you have, like during COVID, there was a huge run up on property values, I mean, maybe 40%. So if you bought a property before COVID and you had that run up on real estate, you're in a pretty nice situation. But typically real estate is a 15, 20-year play because you're riding up the equity.
Right.
Whereas with a franchise, if you get into the right franchise, and you can scale by owning multiple units or territories of the same franchise, or diversify by owning different types of franchises. But if you get into the right franchises, cash flow is going to be a heck of a lot better. And some might cash flow positive in 6 months, some might take a year, some might take a month, really
Mhm.
depending upon the concept. But you're building cash flow a lot more rapidly, and you're building equity more rapidly. It's like I gave the example of that men's health concept, Okay, roughly 325 to get into it. But if we built that, if you build it and you have, you're operating that, let's say you have several of them and you're operating them for a few years, and you decide to put it on the market, and even if you take the lower number and you like a 3 multiple, 1.5 per location times, let's say 3 locations, how's my math? 4.5 million on maybe something that you spent 900 to $1 million on in maybe 3 years, with the right franchise. Now, there's horror stories about franchises as well. If you get into the wrong one, can you fail and lose your assets, whatever you have? Yeah. But if you get into the right ones, the failure rates are going to be infinitely lower. And failure, it doesn't typically mean you're going to lose everything. It typically, whatever you put into it, typically means maybe you have to sell it at something less than you paid for it. But if you have a really good territory and the territory is in demand, and they're just overall, that franchise has a lot of buzz about it and it's in demand, often you can sell it even if you're not profitable for more than you paid for it. If you're profitable and you're doing well, then could be really interesting.
So what's that worst case scenario, Bob? I mean, like, do you have any stories? Like you mentioned horror stories. I'm curious if you have any, just like, obviously keeping people confidential if you don't want to share details, but
Yeah, well, people have walked away. I mean, typically, if it's a failure, flat out failure, you're going to turn the keys back to the franchisor, and 99% of the time, they're not going to hold you to the contract, like minimum royalty fees if you close down operations and so forth. They just want to get the keys back and they want to resell it.
right.
Now, but again, doing that doesn't make a lot of sense, because you can always go back to the franchise company and simply say, hey, I want to put this on the market. I want to sell my franchise. They'll do everything in their power to help you sell it. But also, you're going to have, again, positioning for this upfront puts you in a much better situation to be able to sell if you get into the right franchise at the right timing. So if it's a brand that's growing rapidly and there's a lot of buzz and it's going to be all over the country, it's not going to be difficult to sell at all. If it's a brand that's already all over the country and you've by some stroke of luck, you can get good territory or good location. If there's anything left, that's the problem. Then you're going to be in a great situation. If you're in a brand that is not growing, they might have several hundred franchises, but if they're stagnant and they're not growing at all, usually there's a reason why they're not growing. And typically it has to do with validation, meaning prospective franchisees are talking to the existing franchisees, asking them, how are you doing? You making any money? And if they're not hearing positive things from those existing franchisees, guess what? They're not going to buy a franchise, and a franchise comes to a grinding halt.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned, kind of jumping back to the real estate conversation. Many people, they get into real estate thinking, oh, I'm going to create this big passive income. And what they'll find out the hard way typically is the cash flow barely pays for the maintenance on the property, but the real value, like you said, comes in the long-term appreciation, which over the last few years has been great. But that's always in cycles. So like you mentioned, it's probably a long-term, more of a long-term play there.
Yeah, and I discovered some of my clients who have gotten into real estate, and then they shared with me, well, I didn't want to wait it out. They bought after COVID maybe, and then they like, oh, I'm regretting this. Or it was a while back before COVID, and they held it for 5-7 years, and like, it's not going anywhere, so I'm going to sell it, and then end up in a wash situation.
Right, exactly. So you had your capital tied up for a handful of years, not earning, could have been doing other stuff, right?
Yep.
So how can you pay for franchises, right? Like financing. What does financing a franchise look like? I mean, are most of your investors just cash investors, or do they get financing to start these? What are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, some small percentage will pay cash for a franchise, especially if it's a lower cost franchise. But the vast majority of them, they're getting some type of financing. There are certain entities out there that really specialize in franchise financing. Usually, these entities, they will connect you with the right banks. They know the banks that are working with the various brands. which is, you pay a fee for that? Yes, but it's, in my opinion, it's absolutely worthwhile because they're going to get you the best rates. There's so many different potential instruments. I mean, there's SBA loan. There's something called a 401k rollover or a ROBS program. It can apply to a 401k if it's within your control. If you've either aged out or you control the 401k because it's not with your current employer, or it's an IRA, you can actually, rather than borrow against it, you can invest funds. You can take funds from your 401k without taxation, without penalty, without interest, and roll it into a business, into a franchise.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so probably most of my clients that are eligible for that actually use that structure, because now you have no interest rate to deal with. If you go SBA, what is it now? Maybe 9%, I think, right now. It's not cheap. It's a 10-year term, and I always counsel my clients, try to pay it off in 2, 3, 4 years and be done with it, so you're not carrying that interest rate all
Right.
that. But you can
Yeah.
pay anytime you want.
Yeah. It's like prime plus 2%,
Yeah,
potentially plus, right? So you're looking at like 11, 12%. It's crazy. Crazy high. Hey, y'all, before I forget, if y'all aren't following Bob, go give him a follow on LinkedIn. You can go to his website, franchisewithbob.com, and go check out Bob's franchise website. He also has a semi-passive franchise ebook that I know he'd be willing to share with you as well. How do they get that, Bob?
Yeah, just reach out to me. Go onto my website and reach out to me, or email me at bob@franchisewithbob.com, and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So, what's the most franchises you've owned at one time? Because you make it sound so easy, Bob. You're like, oh yeah, I just bought another franchise like 6 months ago, and then I bought another one 2 weeks ago, and blah blah blah. It's kind
It's
of
got
like, how are you
it's
doing this?
actually because of the semi-passive models and the greater level of sophistication with these franchise companies now versus yesteryear when I first broke into franchising back in, hate to admit, with West Coast Video back in 1986. It was different then, and the level of training and support you got, basically I got a week's worth of training, a pat on the back, and go get them. And somebody would stop by like maybe every 2 months from corporate headquarters to make sure you're not doing anything you're not supposed to be doing. But today's franchising is very different, especially with the semi-passive models. If any of these required me to be in it full time, I couldn't do it. I mean, I'm not even going to put a semi-passive effort into it with each of the concepts that I own now. One I bought 5 months ago, and one I just invested in a couple weeks ago. There's an operator. Someone's going to operate. Now, in both situations, the operator with one, the men's health concept, he is going to do it. He's also an investor in it, so he's going to do it on a full-time basis. He could have done it semi-passive, but he wants to do it full-time. The one that I just bought with a partner, he's going to do it semi-passive. He might put 10, 20 hours a week into it, because that's all it really requires with that one. It's pretty simple. But I'm not.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you like having partnerships like that? I mean, how is it?
So
Just you have good people that you know and trust, obviously.
yeah, so things have to line up. I mean, and I wouldn't have bought either one of these if things didn't line up this way. I mean, I've been interested in some other franchises, but unfortunately, there wasn't an opportunity to work with somebody that I felt comfortable with a concept that I really felt comfortable with, and in a market, this market, my market. I'd rather not step out of my market. So in one case, it was a candidate that I started working with, who was about 45 minutes from me, and I got to know him. I felt pretty confident with him, and it was going to be a stretch for him, capital wise, to get into this men's health concept. So originally he was looking at one unit, which would have still been a stretch for him. But then I said, I'll invest with you. And he said, yeah, it'd be great. He's open to it. So we started talking about 3 units. Then I'm at my gym, and I mentioned to a couple of my buddies at the gym what I'm doing. And they said, hey, can we invest? And so we added some more partners to it. So it's a simple operating agreement. There's actually 5 of us, because another guy that I introduced to another franchise, he loved this as well. He stepped into it. But I'm not involved with the operations at all, other than lend some advice. Then the most recent one that I just got into a couple of weeks ago, been working with this guy for about a year. I showed him so many different concepts, got to know him really well, showed him this concept. He loved it. And he accelerated the discovery process, decided to go forward. And I just asked him flat out, Mario, would you want an investor? Would you be interested in an investor? And that would give you more bandwidth to buy more territory. And he was open to it. So I invested.
Mm-hmm. What type of corporate structures do you use for all your franchises? Is there a consistent sort of strategy you have, like structure wise? Like, do you keep them all in a holding company and a trust? Like, what are you
Yeah.
doing there?
In the early stages, I mean, back when I owned a bunch of West Coast Videos, I mean, I had a separate LLC for everyone. I really regretted that, trying to keep a separate set of books for each one. So, you just want the protection of a corporation or an LLC. I don't think a holding company is necessary. We like the one that we just did with the men's health concept. We have an LLC that's set up for that, and we have a simple operating agreement between us. The new one that the one that I just bought, same thing. The operating agreement hasn't even been put together. We just agreed on terms and so forth. So we'll knock that out. With my consulting business that I'm, my franchise with Bob consulting business, I was an LLC, and then my accountant said it's time to morph over to an S corp. So I just listen to what my accountant says. He's the expert. I don't know that crap.
Cool. Sounds like you got a good team around you, Bob. So, that's very important. And one of the benefits of a good franchisor, I guess, is they have those process systems, obviously backed by the people around it. But having a good accountant. What other advice would you give for potential new business owners thinking about, like, hey, maybe I'll passively, semi-passively, or jumping into a full-time job as a franchisee?
Right.
What advice would you give them as they're starting out?
Well, one thing first, let me touch on the surrounding yourself with the right people. Important to have the right people around you. If you're going to get into business for yourself, having a good accountant. There's so many opportunities to take advantage of, so many ways to pay as little in taxes as possible, which I would prefer to do. I have a great tax strategist. I've been working with this guy for 35 years. He's the best tax strategist I know. I've introduced him to a lot of my clients. If somebody needs a franchise attorney to review agreements, to give them a comfort level, I know a lot of franchise attorneys, one in particular I really like to work with, and he's reasonable. But in terms of your question, which was, Phil, hit me with that again, buddy.
Just advice for new business owners, right? Like, what else? That right there was great advice. But do you have anything that comes to mind that we haven't touched on just yet, where you're thinking, okay, I got somebody who's about to jump in, own their own business, be it a fully, full-time franchise or a semi-passive franchise, or even a small business, traditional business.
Right.
What advice would you give somebody just starting out?
Good question. I would say a couple of things. One, focus on ROI, earnings. Don't focus on what the widget is. As long as it's ethical, provides a valued service to the community, I would focus on ROI and earnings, the best financial opportunities you can. I think the best advice I can give anybody, and there's a great book about that. If you ever, a book called The E-Myth or The E-Myth Revisited, I recommend that book. It talks about this, but so many people will want to chase their passion. And like a lot of people will ask me, why I love my dog, so I want to be in something pet related, or I love baking, so maybe a crumble cookies, something along those lines. They love. So I always, when they're going down the path of passion, I always ask them the question: do you want to make money? How important is making money to you? Because we can pursue passion, but you may learn to hate your passion if you're not profitable with your passion. So maybe we can align everything so your passion fits with the financial piece of it. But what I have found in owning a lot of businesses over my career, you get passionate about running a successful business. You can be very dispassionate about running a business that is failing, which I've done too. Uh, whether it's your passion or not, you're going to learn to hate it if you're not doing well with the business.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece of advice I would give anyone is, if you're considering getting into business, I'd first consider a franchise. Your success rate is going to be considerably better. You have that support network, you have all the training, everything there to back you. Financing is going to be infinitely easier because these banks want to work with franchise companies that have a track record of success. But find somebody who you would consider a franchise expert. They've either owned franchises, maybe they work for a franchise company at a C level or upper management level. Maybe they've done both. Maybe they've owned independent businesses, but ideally, no, trying to understand the franchise world, I'd suggest find somebody that's owned more than one franchise and just pick their brain. And then if you start going down the path of looking at franchises, the single best tool you can utilize is speaking with franchisees of that company. When I'm working with a client, I provide them with a list of questions to ask the franchise companies, but I also provide them with a list of questions to ask the franchisees. You can come up with your own questions as well, but being able to pick their brain, because they'll be very honest with you, pick their brain and validate what the company is telling you is in fact what they are experiencing. If they're
Mm-hmm.
not doing well, they're going to quickly tell you they're not doing well. And if the preponderance or any significant number of franchisees are not doing well, stay away from the company. Now, you're always going to find some franchisee, a small percentage, that are going to be unhappy for one reason or another. You have to sometimes look at that more closely, because if the preponderance of franchisees are doing well, look at who you most likely associate with. Is it these group of people, the larger group of people, or the couple that aren't doing well, and then try to figure out why they aren't doing well versus why these are doing well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice, Bob. I how do you know, like, it's probably in some of those documents you were just talking about, like your list of questions to ask franchisors, but what are some like red flags? Like if you're thinking about getting into a franchise, like what are some of the key red flags where you're just like, whoa, run away if you see that
Yeah,
from a
well,
franchisor?
I would suggest as a category, a big red flag, food in general. Now, I'm not saying all food concepts are a no go, but I think they're few and far between. It's become more and more difficult. It's always been a situation where they're low margin, high turnover, minimum wage employees, and it's gotten worse since COVID because hospitality got killed. The labor rate has gone up heavily in hospitality, so I tend to avoid food related concepts. Um, a lot of litigation on a franchise company's FDD, their franchise disclosure document.
Hmm.
Bigger companies, they can't avoid it. It's going to happen, no doubt. But if there's a lot of litigation, you may want to look at it a little more closely and really understand what that litigation is about. If a franchise company has a high failure rate, they have to disclose that in their franchise disclosure document. And if they have any significant percentage of franchisees that have failed, that's another red flag. Stay away from that
Mm-hmm.
company, or at least
Mm-hmm.
understand why they did. Maybe their model changed, and maybe now
Mm-hmm.
they're more effective. So the newer franchisees coming in the last few years, as opposed to 10 years ago, they're doing a lot better. So it could be the case, but those are some areas to look at.
Have you been litigated, Bob? And I ask because, I think most people, they probably don't think about that aspect of business ownership. No matter what business you start,
Right.
if you're providing a product or service to a large number of people, eventually somebody's going to get mad or something and come after you. It seems like it's happening more and more these days. We're seeing, famous folks in the news in New York, won't name them, but everyone knows who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
getting litigated for who knows why.
Nothing.
And that's not his only litigation going on right now. And, I know a lot of other business owners dealing with stuff like that all the time. So have you gone through that yourself, or what's
Yeah,
your experience with that?
I'll give you at least one example. I mean, again, West Coast Video way back when, I had my locations, and I think this was my second location that I opened, and I had a couple girls come into that location. I wasn't there at the time, but they walked in, they walked out, they walked in, they walked out. I had cameras throughout my store, so we were able to check the video and see what happened. And they walked in several times, walked out, and then one of the girls lays down. There was a slight ramp coming into my location, but I had rails and everything, so it was completely legit. She lays down on the ground, and her friend runs up to the counter and says, "My friend just fell." Then she helps her up, brings her over to the counter. The girl's holding her arm, and her arm is all black and blue.
Oh, geez.
That doesn't happen instantly, right? So, but we knew what happened. We checked the video. The insurance company, they settled with them anyway, which really got under my crawl. I can't believe they did that. But yeah, they sued. The insurance company settled with them because they just didn't want to deal with it, even though we gave them the video evidence. So that kind of really turned me off quite a bit. Yeah. And one time that I had to sue because I had a dietary supplement company, and one company knocked off one of my products. But I mean, they named it on my one of my products. My lead selling product was called BioSculpt. It was a weight loss product, and they came out with BioSculpt or something like that. It was like, and the bottle looked almost identical to our bottle, and we ended up suing, and we prevailed in that. That's the only two I can think of.
Yeah, you seem like a no nonsense guy, Bob. I wonder, as I meet folks like yourself, and I think about the successful business owners that I know, it takes the type of personality that, isn't going to take crap from people, right? And, isn't going to settle like, hey, this person's ripping off my product. Like, I'm going to go after them and make sure they're not doing that, right? And protect your territory.
Yeah.
How do you think about that from a mindset perspective?
No, I agree. I mean, I don't think you can. I think you have to take a stand sometimes, and even if you're going to end up spending more money taking that stand, I think it makes sense to do it. In some cases, there's not much you can do, and the entity maybe can outspend you 10 times, 20 times, 1,000 times over. GNC, that same product, along with a couple of others. GNC was one of my major clients that we sold product to. At one point, they had a 40% concentration in GMC. They were accounting for 40% of my product, purchasing products from me. And one of the products, they were buying from me, the top selling product. They were putting it on their shelf, and they reverse engineered the product, put it next to my product.
Wow.
There for half price, and say, look, compare this to BioSculpt at half the price. Look at the ingredients. And like, I talked to them about it. Was it worth trying to sue them? No, I just didn't even bother, because they were going to just take me to the carpet and spank me because I didn't have that type of bankroll to handle GNC.
Man. Yeah, it's the stuff you deal with in business. It's cutthroat out there. You got to be ready to take your territory and protect your territory.
Got a new gun though.
There you go. What other business mindset comes to mind? I mean, do you have, like, as you think about business ownership and the the mindset you need to be successful, are there any key mindset things? Like, everybody's got their routine these days. I don't want to be cheesy with like what's your morning routine, Bob, but like, what have you done to shape your mindset over the years in business?
Man, that's a good question, because I really don't. I find myself at times I can be damn lazy, but I get tunnel vision, and when I want to accomplish something, I don't let go of it, and everything else may fall to the wayside, and those things may suffer. But if I'm focused on something, I'm not saying that that's the best way to go about it from a business perspective. But the other thing I would say is, you're not going to get wealthy by doing something yourself. Okay. No one's going to get wealthy unless you, in a W-2, unless you get luckier and at the right time and you get stock. And those stories are few and far between. You're not going to get wealthy unless you leverage other people. And you need some type of business to do that. And again, that's why I am opposed to consulting type franchises where you are the product. Like what I'm doing right now as a franchise consultant is linear income. When I do this, I make money. If I stop doing it, I stop making money. That's why I invest in franchises. I do this more for a passion play. I make good money doing it, but I do this because I get to help other people kind of realize their dreams, and that I get a great kick out of helping people with that.
Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
really awesome. What's your family background, Bob? You're an East Coast guy, right?
Yeah. I grew up actually on a farm maybe about 7 minutes from where I live now.
Oh,
Yeah, I moved to Virginia for 11 years, Maryland for 7 years. Bought a company with a partner, a controlling interest of a company in. It was actually in Sioux City, Iowa. I moved corporate headquarters to Omaha, Nebraska. I wasn't about to live in Sioux City next to a pig processing plant. So lived there for a little over a year. Sold my stock and moved back. My wife hated it out there, so abandoned it. And then I moved back to my roots, so I'm very close to where I grew up. I grew up on a farm, and eminent domain. They took our property.
oh wow.
Yeah, my dad fought it for many years. He was written up in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Gallup Local News. Many times he ended up representing himself, fired all the lawyers, but you can't beat the state. They eventually got us out, and that was regrettable.
Dang.
That was a great way to grow up. But I grew
That's an
up.
experience. Do you think that shaped you at all? Did that stick with you?
Yeah, you know
That
what?
experience?
You see, as you pointed out, what's happening in New York, and you recognize, the power the government has and how little power you have if they turn their sights to you.
Right.
And there was just my dad fought it for a long time. We were the very last family that they got out, and we actually caused a whole project. It was a reservoir and park. They dammed a creek and created Marsh Creek State Park.
Wow.
But my dad fought it forever. But unfortunately, he just did not prevail in the end. And it was a great way to grow up, though. I mean, learning a work ethic it was a non-working farm. We cut hay and sold hay and had some animals, and that's always had some horses. But it was just cool. And I kind of rented myself out to local farmers. Loved to bale hay during hay baling season. I don't know what it was
Awesome.
with that, but yeah,
Hard work. Good hard American work.
it's good.
Back in the day, I lived on a farmhouse surrounded by cornfields just outside of a town in Illinois with a population of 650 people. So
Nice.
middle of nowhere, farm country, heartland, USA, flyover states, the whole deal.
Yeah.
And my neighbor would pick me up in his combine during the harvest, right, and take me for combine rides, and I loved it, and it was awesome. But
Yeah.
it's been a while since then. Now I'm a full grown city boy. Who I get calluses easy if I start to do any real work.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I try to avoid the cities, but I'm a suburbanite at this point.
There you go. Well, Bob, this has been really fun. I got to ask you the final question. Do you have kids, Bob?
I do. Too many.
So, what's that?
I have too many. Do you need some? I
have, how many you got?
5. I have 4 daughters and a son. My oldest daughter, you've spoken to, Megan. She's 26. She's been working for me for the last 3 years. She's breaking into the franchise world.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, so I've got the one, and my wife and I have another on the way. I can't remember if I told you that or not.
Yes, man.
And, so we're excited about that. When I started the podcast, Bob, one of the fun kind of mindset reasons behind it, I had heard from a guy named Gary Vaynerchuk. I don't know if you know Gary V.
I know the name.
Yeah. Pretty well-known entrepreneur type dude. But he was just talking about how, you might have one picture of your great grandpa, right? But your kids and their kids are going to have, tens of thousands of photos and, hundreds and hundreds of videos. And if you start something like a podcast, right? Like, how cool would it be to see your great grandpa talking with some business guy named Bob from 100 years ago, right? So who knows who's going to see this podcast generations from now, right? It's going to live in the cyberverse or whatever.
Right. But years from now, they'll probably have it where it's 3D and it pops up in front of you like another
Yeah.
human being, right?
Yeah, exactly. But with that in mind, not knowing how many future generations might see this, Bob, what is one thing that you would want to leave those future generations with today?
Damn, you should have given me an inkling of this question. Where do
It's
I?
a put on the spot question, Bob.
It's,
It's a tough one, I know.
what would I that I have tried to help a lot of people, and I believe I've helped a lot of people find something that will change their life. And that's most noted by people coming back to me. And I have a lot of testimonials, and a lot of people have come back to me and thanked me profusely. But also, I think so many people have referred. Most of my clients are coming from referrals now from other people that I have worked with, and a lot of my clients will come back to me and they're looking for a second franchise, in some cases a third franchise. That's heartwarming. If anything else I can leave is that I touched a lot of people's lives, and hopefully for the positive.
Yeah, that's awesome. You heard it, folks. If you go out there, touch people's lives, and you never know what kind of impact you can make in this world. That's what Go Lead Everything's all about. So as you go, share the show. Go check out franchisewithbob.com. And as you go, folks, go lead everything.